physiology, nothing more than that. That word is very important, or rather that sentence. At the onset of critical illness, our aim is to stabilize the patient's physiological derangements. If the saturation is low, we can give oxygen. If the blood pressure is low, we can do simple interventions like putting an intravenous cannula and giving IV fluids. So by doing these simple interventions, we can prevent the patient going into a state of irreversible organ damage. So as you all can see, as we move on to the right, the number of non-survivors increase and the number of survivors decrease. If you look at the bottom, initially initially what we had to do is doing simple interventions like giving oxygen through a face mask. Then when we go towards the right, the nature of the intervention or the nature of the intervention becomes more sophisticated. Oxygen, IV fluids, then ultimately the patient is connected to various machines, the ventilator or the CRRT machine for renal replacement therapy, or maybe balloon pumps to increase the blood pressure. Although the nature of the intervention or the complexity of the intervention increases, what happens is the number of survivors will decrease and the number of non-survivors will increase. We should be mindful about one more thing. At the onset of critical illness, if we detect critical illness appropriately, it will cost a few rupees. But if you go to the right-hand extreme, with the amount of money we spend, we will be able to build another hospital. Or maybe we will be able to purchase a lot of equipment, sophisticated equipment. So this slide also illustrates the fact that we should detect critical illness at an early stage. And unless we do it, the outcome will not be good. And the cost will also be very high. Again, if it's so simple to detect critical illness and to act appropriately and to prevent, and if we can prevent the patient going into organ damage, what's happening? What's going wrong? There's this concept called deterioration to door time. That means unless we do appropriate interventions by detecting critical illness at an early stage, the outcome would be poor. The higher the deterioration to door time, the worse the outcome. So these are some of the causes I could think as to why there are problems in detecting critically ill patients and as to why there are problems in escalation of care. First and foremost, in the top of the list, delay in recognition, lack of knowledge to detect critical illness. Then communication issues. Communication issues are a serious problem among medical personnel. It may be between doctors, or maybe it may be between doctors and nurses, etc. Then effective handovers. Think about the last time you handed over a patient. If you are working in the ICU, think about the last time a patient was handed over to you when a patient was brought from a ward or from the ETU. How effective was that handover? It has been shown that by research, the number of effective handovers are very minimal. So we should have a structured approach to effective handovers. So if you could look at, if you critically analyze these causes, the topmost causes are reversible, isn't it? by education, we can address these issues. Fourth one, availability of ICU beds. That's something that we can't like, that's something which is difficult to address, isn't it? Availability of ICU beds. Being a third world country and a developing country, it's one of the most serious issues that we face. Then clinician judgment. Even if you recognize the numbers, as I showed in the previous slide, if your judgment goes wrong, the patient will suffer. Availability of staff to transfer. Say you detect that the patient is critically ill and detect that the patient is going into organ failure. Unless you transfer the patient in a timely manner to the ICU, it will have a bad impact on the patient. That also counts. So this is something that the people thought of with the aim of addressing delay in recognition of critically ill patients. This is the first concept which came up, chain of survival. I think this is the most frequently, this is the concept which is most frequently addressed in our setting. It's with regard to cardiac arrest. It says that you should recognize a patient in cardiac arrest early. You should start chest compressions early. Then you should deliver shock early. And that's not the end of the story. You have to look after the patient after there's return of spontaneous circulation. Or in other words, when the heart stops, you have to detect it early, give chest compressions, restart the heart, and look after the patient in the ICU and make sure the patient goes home. So that's the whole concept of chain of survival. I think chain of prevention is more important than chain of survival. There are 5 links or 5 circles which are interlinked in chain of prevention. On the left side, you have education. That's exactly what I'm doing today. Education is not enough. You have to utilize the knowledge you have gained and apply it to the patients. By doing that, you monitor the patients, monitor for derangements in physiological parameters, then you recognize the abnormalities. You have to call for help appropriately, and the person who comes will generate an adequate response. So ultimately, the patient will benefit. Now, coming into assessment of critically ill patients or the deteriorating patient, the question is how we are going to do it. There's a framework which we can apply in the management of a deteriorating patient. It is called the direct methodology. It's something which is followed by the Society of Critical Care Medicine in USA, and I think that it's applicable to anywhere else. So talking about the direct methodology, there are 5 key things in it. Early detection or detection of the deteriorating patient, generating an adequate intervention. Once you do an intervention in a critically ill patient, you can't just forget about the patient because the patient is so dynamic. The blood pressure might be 130 over 90 at one point, and within 2 or 3 minutes, the blood pressure can crash to 60 or 40. So the important thing that I would like to highlight is once you detect something abnormal in a patient, of course, you should intervene, and then you should not forget about the patient. You should go and reassess the patient. And the detection, intervention, reassessment are interlinked. Once you reassess the patient, you can't just forget about the patient. You must again look for any deterioration of the patient by monitoring the patient. So in order for you to have in order for you to detect a critically ill patient, do some interventions, and to reassess, you should have adequate subject knowledge, and you should have skills, the critical care skills, from cannulation, intubation to central line insertion. But the subject knowledge and the skills, critical care skills, will not be enough for a favorable patient outcome. There are other aspects which are called non-technical skills. Out of those, effective communication and teamwork play a significant role. So unless you act as a team, and unless you communicate effectively within the team, it will affect the outcome of the patient. So when it comes to assessment of a critically ill patient, when you're called upon to see a deteriorating patient, unless you know what to go and assess, there's no point in going and assessing the patient. It will be a haphazard assessment. When you go to assess a patient, you should have several questions in mind. The first question is, you are assessing a deteriorating patient. It's not just a patient who is in a medical ward who has been admitted to treat hypertension or for blood sugar control. This is a deteriorating patient with significant derangements in physiological functions in the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, urinary system, and other systems. So the questions you should ask from yourself is, how sick is the patient? Whether I can salvage the patient with simple interventions, or whether the patient needs high-fi interventions. Then one of the most important questions you should ask yourself is whether the deterioration is due to a reversible illness. This the word reversible is extremely important. Always ask that question, whether the patient has a reversible component. If the patient is in end-stage organ failure, whatever you do will be in vain, and it will just prolong the suffering of the patient. If the patient has a transplant plan, it's a different story. So always ask the question whether the patient has a reversible illness. The next question, what are the physiological abnormalities which should be corrected? Does the patient need oxygen, IV fluids, etc.? Next one, will this patient be benefited by an ICU? This goes in hand with the reversible illness component. Unless the patient has a reversible illness, the patient will not be benefited by an ICU. It will just prolong the suffering of the patient, the suffering of the relatives. That's it. Then ask, what is the premorbid status of the patient? Is the patient independent in day-to-day life? And last but not the least, does the patient retain capacity? So when it comes to assessment, we go by the primary survey and secondary survey. So you might wonder why I am talking about primary survey and secondary survey in a patient who is not in trauma. We talk about primary survey and secondary survey in advanced trauma life support, isn't it? It's a structured approach to a trauma patient. Initially, you do the primary survey and address the life-threatening problems and correct it then and there. Then after the initial stabilization, you do the secondary survey and check whether there's something you have missed. And moving on forwards from there, you do the tertiary survey as well. So with regard to assessment of a deteriorating patient, you can apply the same principles. You have to take a history, examine the patient, do the chart review and do the appropriate documentation, send off the appropriate investigations, and do the treatment. So all of these components are applicable to primary survey and secondary survey. The primary survey is where you would do a quick assessment within minutes and you would identify the life-threatening problems. And the purpose of doing a primary survey is to identify the main physiological problem. Again, I would like to reiterate the fact that the primary survey is done to identify the main physiological problem, nothing else. We would not bother about the diagnosis of the patient. Within the first minutes or so, you would identify the main physiological derangements. For example, if the blood pressure is, whether the blood pressure is low, or whether the patient is tachycardic, or whether the patient is tachypneic, or the patient's SATs are low. So that would lead to cardiac arrest unless you address it. So again, the main purpose of primary survey is to identify the main physiological problem and to stabilize the patient. Then comes the secondary survey. Secondary survey comes after initial stabilization. You do a ABCD assessment and stabilize the patient, and then move on to do a secondary survey where you would thoroughly examine the patient, go through the patient's notes, take a detailed history, and you would determine the underlying cause for the deterioration. That's secondary survey. So when it comes to primary survey, first you have to, your assessment and history taking should go hand in hand. So in the primary survey, you would focus on main features of circumstances and the environment. You would get a focus history from the witnesses, healthcare personnel or relatives. And then you would focus on 4 main symptoms, nothing else. Whether the patient is in pain, whether the patient is dyspneic, whether there's altered mental status, or whether there's obvious weakness. Then determine whether it's trauma or non-trauma. It's straightforward, isn't it? Operative or non-operative. Whether the patient has taken any medications or toxins. In contrast, during the secondary survey, which is shown on the right side, you analyze the presenting complaint, go through the past history, look at the hospital course, whether the patient has been improving or deteriorating, check about the physical independence, medications and allergy, and other standard stuff. When it comes to examination, in the primary survey, you follow the look, listen, and feel approach. And you go through airway, breathing, circulation, disability, where you do a quick focus assessment of the neurological system, and then you expose the patient and look for any abnormalities. Whereas in the secondary survey, in the secondary survey, you do a structured examination in the respiratory, cardiovascular, and all the other systems. Then comes chart review or documentation. You check the charts whether somebody has been monitoring the patient. And the most important thing is you would not look at isolated values. You would always look at the trends, whether the trends are improving or worsening. There's no point in looking at an isolated value with regard to a critically ill patient. So you look at the heart rate rhythm, how has been the blood pressure trends, how has the patient's respiratory rate been fluctuating during the past 12 hours or 24 hours, what has been the saturation, and what has been the level of consciousness of the patient. Then when you move on to the secondary survey, you do a thorough evaluation. You examine medical records, formulate a diagnosis or maybe differential diagnosis if the diagnosis is not straightforward. And then you do a detailed documentation of the current events. Next one, investigations. So in the primary survey, we are interested about point of care testing. In the primary survey, our aim is to identify life-threatening abnormalities. So there is no pointing in ordering investigations and waiting for the investigations for 1 hour or so. The investigation should be available then and there. So with the aim of extracting as much as information possible, we do 2 investigations in the primary survey. We do arterial blood gas analysis. If you can't obtain arterial blood gas, you can go for venous blood gas. Then you check the blood glucose. In the secondary survey, we go for the routine laboratory tests, radiology, electrocardiography, or microbiology. So with the advent of point of care ultrasound testing, one might argue that point of care ultrasound testing comes into the primary survey. You can do a bedside echo and assess the heart, or maybe the lungs, or you can also assess the abdomen and look for free fluid. So I would say that radiology comes both to primary survey and secondary survey. Then treatment. In the primary survey, all these steps proceeds in parallel. So what you would do in the treatment is you make sure ARV is patent, give oxygen, give IV fluids, then reassess, and you call for help. So I'll go through the primary survey in subsequent slides again because it's the most important thing in the first few minutes. Then when it comes to secondary survey, you think about providing organ-specific support. Either the patient needs mechanical ventilation, renal replacement therapy, or other modes of support. Then you have to choose the most appropriate site of care. The question you should ask is whether I can manage the patient in the ward, in an HDU, or in an ICU. Then you should take advice from other specialties as well. So when it talks about when it comes to primary survey, if someone asks you how would you assess a deteriorating patient, which is the same question I asked at the beginning of this talk, you would say I would do ABCD assessment. Although most of the people know that the approach to a critically ill patient is ABCD assessment, they don't have a clear idea as to what you would assess in the ABCD assessment and what you would do. So at each stage, you would not do a detailed assessment. The main priority is to identify life-threatening abnormalities and to correct it. So with the aim of that, you do the look, listen, and feel maneuver. And then most importantly, before you move from one step to another, say you assess the airway, and before you move on to breathing, you should do the corrective treatment and then always reassess. And if you encounter any problem at any stage, say at A, if you detect that the airway is obstructed and you need to intubate the patient, if you are not experienced, please call the appropriate person. In circulation, if the blood pressure is low, and if you think that the patient needs a central line, then you should call for help. First, we'll talk about the airway. So you go by the ABCD approach according to the, you go by the ABCD approach because you have to prioritize according to the priority. If there's some problem in the airway, it will kill before breathing, likewise. So in the airway assessment, there are 4 questions that you should address. Is there airway obstruction? Are the protective reflexes intact? Can the patient have difficult airway? And what has happened to the respiratory drive? Mind you, it comes with breathing as well. So in airway assessment, when you do the look, listen, and feel maneuver, you look for cyanosis, both central and peripheral. Mind you, it's like at the end of the spectrum where when the patient is cyanosed, he'll be in impending cardiac arrest. Look whether there's altered respiratory pattern, use of accessory muscles, presence of tracheal tug, whether there's paradoxical breathing, whether there is subcostal and intercostal recessions, and whether there's altered level of consciousness, which would put the patient's airway at risk. Then listen for noisy breathing. Check whether there's added sounds like grunting, stridor, wheezing, or gurgling. If there's silence, that it might indicate complete obstruction. So you should be mindful about it because air won't be moving in and out of the airways. Then look for hoarseness, which might suggest that there is laryngeal edema, for example, in anaphylaxis. Then feel for decreased or absent flow. So after assessment of the airway, you have to routinely give oxygen, 15 liters per minute. And how you would give it? You should not use the nasal prongs. You should not use the face mask, but you would use a non-rebreathing face mask. If you could recall the first case that I showed at the beginning of the talk, it was a case about a patient who had a flail chest and who had acute deterioration. The patient's saturation dropped to 60 and the patient was given oxygen via face mask using 15 liters. But ideally, the patient should have been given 15 liters per minute oxygen via non-rebreathing face mask. Then we move on to breathing. So in the assessment of breathing, we should look for causes of inadequate breathing. Is it due to decreased respiratory drive, due to decreased respiratory effort, or due to pulmonary disorders? So in the breathing assessment, this is the first thing that you should measure, the respiratory rate. Most of the people have forgotten about the respiratory rate or rather ignore it. Especially if you are in a surgical ward, you would completely ignore the respiratory rate. The respiratory rate would be counted only in most of the time in medical patients or in patients in the pediatric ward. The respiratory rate is the earliest sign that would indicate that the patient is heading towards critical illness. If the respiratory rate is abnormal in anybody, a young patient, an elderly patient, a neonate, whoever it is, please always look for a cause for it, because it might be the first sign that might indicate or that might give a clue as to that the patient is moving towards disaster. So still you do the look, listen and feel maneuver. You look for cyanosis, altered level of consciousness, tracheal tug, use of accessory muscles, altered pattern, then equality and depth of breaths, and the saturation. You listen for noisy breathing, whether there are added sounds, ronchi or creps. And you percuss and listen for the percussion note, whether it's hyperresonant in case of pneumothorax or stoniral in case of pleural effusion. Then you feel for the trachea, look for subcutaneous crepitus and check the chest expansion, whether it's symmetrical or not. So at the end of breathing, what you do is you put the pulse oximeter and check the saturation. Sometimes the pulse oximeter and checking saturation would be misleading. When the patient is on oxygen, sometimes the saturation would be 100. But people forget that saturation doesn't give an indication about the patient's ventilation. By inspiring and expiring, the patient takes oxygen in and moves out carbon dioxide. So unless the patient has a decent respiratory rate or decent respiratory drive, or unless the patient's respiratory mechanics are functioning normally, the patient would not be able to clear out the carbon dioxide. Even in a patient with a respiratory rate of 8, for example, if the patient has a morphine overdose, the respiratory rate will go down. And the nurses or some doctors in the ward would put oxygen and the saturation would be 100, and that would be misleading, because ultimately the carbon dioxide will be accumulated and the patient will go into respiratory arrest. So mind you, when you assess breathing with pulse oximetry, you should be mindful about the fact that pulse oximetry doesn't give an idea about ventilation. It just gives an idea about oxygen saturation. So at the end of airway and breathing assessment, you can determine whether the patient is in respiratory failure, where the respiratory system is unable to meet the demands of the body. It could be type 1 respiratory failure, where the oxygenation is low, and in type 2, where the oxygenation is low plus carbon dioxide is high. So you should be able to diagnose respiratory failure by the end of clinical examination, plus by doing an arterial blood gas. When it comes to circulation, the circulatory problems can be twofold. It could be primary, directly involving the heart, and it could be secondary, where the pathology could be elsewhere. Classical example is sepsis or septic shock. In circulation, it's standard stuff, isn't it? Look, listen, and feel. Check pulse rate, rhythm, volume, blood pressure, JVP, auscultate for heart sounds, and check whether the periperies are warm or cold, check the capillary filling, etc. So after circulation, what you would do is you would put an IV cannula, take a blood gas, connect the patient to the monitor, and most important thing that you should do at the end of circulation is giving IV fluids. Nowadays, doctors have a great reluctance to give IV fluids. I can't work out the reason for that. Most of the people think that after giving 500 ml or 1 liter of fluid to a patient, that the patient can go into heart failure. They are so reluctant to give fluids. Most of the time, if the patient, say for example, if the patient has features of sepsis and low blood pressure, they give 500 ml of normal saline or 1 liter of normal saline and stress, like without any hesitancy, without thinking twice, they straight away start IV noradrenaline to a peripheral cannula. So you must get rid of the fear of getting fluids. For example, if there's a patient who is young, if you could recall the second case I showed at the beginning of this talk, a patient came with fever, vomiting, and diarrhea, and inguinal lumps. On admission, patient's blood pressure was 50/40. It's a real case. And the advice which was given to the nurses were to give 500 ml of normal saline in 1 hour. And thereafter to start NORAD 0.2 mics per kg per minute. The problem is people have the luxury of starting NORAD whenever they want. From like even the house officers can order NORAD. I think the people are under the impression that NORAD is something like giving IV saline or IV heart transfer peripheral cannula, but it's not the fact. NORAD is a dangerous drug. Unless you adequately feel the patient, there is no place to start NORAD or any other vasopressor or any other inotrope. So don't think twice if the patient is young and healthy about giving fluids. So get rid of this bad habit of giving 500 ml of normal saline or 1 liter and then thinking about starting IV fluids. Another classical example is if the patient's urine output drops, then what you would do is most of the people would give 500 ml of normal saline and they would give furosemide. Most of the time, patients go into acute kidney injury because of pre-renal failure. So unless you adequately fluid resuscitate the patient's kidneys will not be perfused and the patient will not produce urine. So that's a classical example when where you restrict, like you don't adequately fluid resuscitate the patient. Patient goes into AKI, gives 500 ml of normal saline, restrict fluids, and give furosemide. That's a classic example. Just think whether you have done it. Then disability. So most of the people don't understand what's meant by disability. In disability, you look for 3 things. Mainly you look like do a focused neurological examination. You do the GCS. Like just saying patient's GCS is 14 or 13 doesn't mean anything. Always when you do the GCS, do the breakdown. Tell motor component is this much, verbal is this much, and eye component is this much. And look at the pupils, the size and the reactivity, because the pupils are an external window which reflects the intracranial pressure. So it's very important. And check the blood sugar. You can easily do a capillary blood sugar, and if the blood sugar is low, you can correct it. Unless you correct blood sugar, if the patient is hypoglycemic, the patient can suffer irreversible brain damage. So in disability, although the things are very simple, they are of utmost clinical importance. And even the investigation, most of the time people will forget to do blood pressure in the ABCD. Most of the time people will forget to do blood sugar in the ABCD assessment. See how important it is, although it's a very simple bedside investigation. Next, exposure. By exposing, we quickly remove the clothes or remove the covering of the patient, protecting the dignity of the patient, and look whether there are obvious abnormalities, whether there are fractures, any scars, ankle edema, etc. And at that, and like when you expose the patient, you should be mindful about the fact about preventing hypothermia, and you should check the temperature as well. So in the ABCD assessment, you do simple stuff, isn't it? Airway, assess, give oxygen, or non-rebreathing face mask, 15 liters. In B, you do the look, listen, and feel maneuver. Look for any respiratory problem and check the pulse saturation via pulse oximetry. In circulation, look, listen, and feel. Put cannula, take bloods, ABG, blood sugar, and give IV fluids, adequate IV fluids. In D, you do three things: GCS, pupils, and blood sugar. And E, you expose the patient and check the temperature. So it's very simple stuff, but mind you, it will address the life-threatening physiological derangements and stabilize the patient. So this is exactly what I had been talking during the past 10 minutes. It gives a snapshot about the ABCD assessment and what exactly you're going to assess. Okay, so coming on to the last part of my talk, I have put up a slide which I showed earlier, which shows the severity of critical illness with time. Initially, the patient starts deteriorating. The patient goes into reversible organ failure and irreversible organ failure. So as healthcare providers, our aim is to detect the point at which patient starts to deteriorate. So with the aim of that, people have formulated something called early warning systems. The people have named various parameters and they have monitored it, and they have given various scores for each physiological parameter. It's predefined. If a patient, so once a patient reaches a certain value in the parameters, which is defined earlier, you call for help. And with this concept, the concept of rapid response systems evolved. So it's a standard structure which is used to recognize and manage critically ill patients. So these early warning systems will have an efferent limb and an efferent limb. So the efferent limb should be able to and should be sensitive enough to detect deteriorating patients. So what you do is you maintain a monitoring chart and observe the trends of the patient. So as I told earlier, with regard to critically ill patient, isolated values are useless. You must always look at the trends, whether the patient is improving, whether the blood pressure is coming down, whether the blood pressure is coming up, or whether the blood pressure is static. Likewise for other parameters. So by observing these parameters, people put up a response. If the heart rate is going high or the blood pressure is going low, you track the changes in the physiology and trigger. Trigger means you call somebody else. So depending on the parameter monitored, it could be a single parameter, which was done earlier. Then the multi-parameter systems evolved. And then you have the aggregate weighted system where you give scores to various parameters and take a cumulative score and call for help. So efferent limb is where you call for help. So according to the setting and different regions of the world, you call it by various names. You have the rapid response teams or the medical emergency teams or the critical care outreach services. And mind you, all of them will be multidisciplinary teams. So there will be a nurse, sometimes advanced critical care practitioners, and doctors and anesthetists, critical care specialists or emergency physicians. So it's a multidisciplinary team. So I have compared the two charts. The first chart is the chart which I showed during the initial bit of my talk. and I have put up a new chart. So if you could appreciate the difference between the two charts, the one on the chart at once, you can quickly identify the abnormalities. And you can appreciate the trends. And according to the parameters are given certain colors. And if the patient moves from the baseline up to the red side, it indicates that the patient is heading towards disaster. So according to the parameter, you give a score to each of the parameters, and it's predefined. It says that if the respiratory rate is between 12 and 20, you don't have to call the med team. But if the respiratory rate goes from 21 to 29, you have to call the med team. Likewise, it's applicable to other parameters as well. So I have put up another slide which shows the early warning scoring system, or rather the chart which monitors the patient's parameters. And initially you have the respiratory parameters, then saturation, whether the patient is on air, oxygen, blood pressure, pulse, etc. So by tracking and triggering, you monitor the vital parameters of the patient, the respiratory rate, saturation, whether the patient is on air, oxygen, systolic blood pressure, pulse, consciousness, and temperature. And according to the score the patient gets, you call for help, and it is known as a graded escalation policy. This is the same thing. When there's a derangement in the respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, or the temperature, you call for help when the patient's scoring reaches a certain value, and it's predefined. When it comes to med teams, there are certain characteristics of a med team. The med team should be able to respond immediately. Responding immediately is of utmost importance because you are dealing with a critically ill patient. So the people should be available on site, and they should have the critical care skills which is needed to assess and do the needful for the patients. So when it comes to goals of rapid response teams or med teams, there are certain things that we should consider. One thing is it will improve patient safety. Then there will be a structured approach to emergencies. They will methodically assess the patients and do the needful. And in addition to assessing the patients, they would take decisions regarding critical care. They would really assess whether the patient will be benefited by admitting to critical care. And there will be better access to critical care. They should be doing hospital education as well. Mind you, the goals of med team or medical emergency team is not restricted to seeing patients who need admission to ICU. They should follow up ICU discharge patients as well, because those patients are at risk of deterioration. So ultimately, the goal of the rapid response team or medical emergency team or critical care outreach team is to prevent cardiac arrest and to improve outcome. So this is a slide which shows, which summarizes what I had told you in the past 5 minutes or so about monitoring the patients. And once a patient reaches a certain value, depending on the physiological parameters, how the escalation is done, initially to a nurse and maybe to a doctor. But if the patient has any obvious signs outside those predefined parameters, for example, if you could recall the monitoring chart, there was no place for stridor. So if you encounter any problem, or if the patient is seizing, if you encounter any problem outside the chart, you can always call the emergency team. So if you could recall the direct methodology, where detection, intervention, and reassessment is of importance to assessing a critically ill patient, effective communication and teamwork also play a significant role. unless you do effective communication and teamwork, which are known as non-technical skills, you would not be able to achieve a good outcome for the patient. So when it comes to teamwork, there are several components. There should be a leader. There should be skills in crisis resource management. You have to assign roles, and you should have situational awareness. Situational awareness is you should have an overall idea as to what is going on. Then you should be able to balance resources and use the available resources to treat the patient. Then communication is also very important. I told that communication failure gives rise to critical incidents. With regard to communication, there are two important aspects that I would like to highlight. One thing is the handing over using the SBAR method and closed loop communication. Closed loop communication is during assessment of a critically ill patient. Once you do a certain thing, you have to feedback to the person who have asked to do that. For example, if the team leader asks you to do arterial blood gas, you should do arterial blood gas and communicate it back to the team leader and tell that I have done the arterial blood gas and these are the results. So unless you do a closed loop communication, everybody will assume that something has been done, but actually it's not the case. Then last not the least, you should be mindful about professionalism when you deal with patients. So when it comes to the handing over, you should follow this SBAR method. There are various methods available, but this is one of the standard methods and it's very easy. So S is situation. You give a concise statement of the problem. For example, if there's a patient who is deteriorating due to pneumonia, situation is, okay, there's a 56-year-old patient in the medical ward who has a right lower lobe pneumonia and he has desaturated. Background is, you give a brief summary about the patient. You can tell he is a previously healthy patient or a patient with COPD, came to the hospital 3 days back and was treated with IV antibiotics and was on oxygen. And suddenly, like during the past 3 days, patient has been deteriorating. Assessment is, what are your findings? You can say that the patient's respiratory is this much, heart rate is this much, and blood pressure is this much, etc. And recommendation. What you recommend to do: central line, non-invasive ventilation. Each time when you hand over a critically ill patient to the ICU, or when you hand over a critically ill patient from the ETU to the ICU, use this SBAR method. So regarding medical emergency team consultations, it could be a new consultation, a follow-up consultation, or ICU discharge follow-up. So the medical emergency teams play a significant role with regard to providing critical care services. So when a med team assesses a patient, they should always assess the eligibility for ICU admission. When you encounter deteriorating patient, you should ultimately, if the patient's physiological parameters are deranged, the patient will need organ support, isn't it? So by admitting to the ICU, what we do is providing organ support. So before admitting to ICU, you should ask several questions from yourself. Whether there's acute onset organ dysfunction, which is reversible. Unless it's reversible, there's no point in admitting the patient to ICU. Then check whether there are adequate reserves, whether there are chronic comorbidities, and you should be mindful about the potential short-term and long-term outcome. So I will quickly go through the levels of care. These are the places where you could admit a deteriorating patient. Level 1, obviously, you can't admit a deteriorating patient because it's a normal hospital ward. Level 1, you can do like simple things like giving oxygen via face mask. Level 2 and level 3 are places where you could provide organ support. In level 2, you provide only one organ support, and in level 3 beds, you provide full-blown organ support. So you might wonder why I have included this slide. So this shows the countries with the most critical care beds per capita. Even in the United States, per 100,000 people, you have only 34 beds. And you can clearly see that critical care beds are a valuable resource. So the main aim of introducing the concept of medical emergency teams or rapid response teams was to prevent unnecessary ICU admissions. So given the fact that critical care beds are a very valuable resource, we should be able to handle the available beds efficiently. So for that, by minimizing unnecessary ICU admissions with the help of a rapid, one thing is we can save a life of a patient and we can reduce unnecessary costs. So to finish my talk, I had two take-home messages. Unless you detect a patient at the reversible state, that's the end of the story. You will admit the patient to ICU, the patient will undergo all the harassment, and ultimately the patient will die. Next slide, chain of prevention. So what I'm doing today is the first circle of the chain of prevention. That's education. Then one recommendation. In some hospitals, I know the critical care outreach teams or medical emergency teams or rapid response teams are established. But in most of the places, people don't have an idea about it. And I think it's high time that we establish critical care outreach teams, medical emergency teams, or rapid response teams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, sir. It's time to enlighten few queries.
There's a question. It asks, what should be the approach for deteriorating in COVID platform? Important deviation from usual. So with regard to a deteriorating patient whom we suspected to have a COVID-19 infection, one thing is before approaching the patient, we should have personal protective equipment. If the patient is in cardiac arrest, there are several deviations that you should follow. One thing is when the patient is in cardiac arrest, we check for responsiveness, do the look, listen, and feel maneuver. And if the patient is unresponsive, we straight away start chest compressions. So in a COVID-19 patient, what we do is we don't look, listen, and do the look, listen, and feel maneuver. We look externally at the patient and check whether the patient is breathing normally. If the patient is not breathing normally, we won't start chest compressions, and we can check the pulse, but we won't start chest compressions if there's no pulse. What we do is we would leave the oxygen if the patient is on oxygen, and unless somebody comes with personal protective equipment, we would not start chest compressions because there's a risk of aerosol generation. So that's one of the deviations. And there's a place for early intubation. So this is, I'm talking about cardiac arrest. So this is like a different topic that we should discuss in depth, cardiac arrest in a COVID-19 patient. But if you detect a patient, if you suspect a patient is in cardiac arrest, what you would do is you would check the pulse. You would not do the look, listen, and feel maneuver, but you would keep the oxygen on the patient. And then until somebody comes with personal protected equipment, you would not start chest compressions. You can do something like putting a cannula, giving adrenaline, or giving IV fluids.
Very much, sir, for that informative presentation. And if there are no more queries, I would like to thank Dr. Chamin Veerasekara on behalf of GMOA and Society for Health Research and Innovation. And I call upon Dr. Dineshan, Secretary of Society for Health Research and Innovation, to present the token of appreciation to the speaker. Thank you, Dr. Dineshan. With that, I conclude the webinar. Thank you all to listening us patiently. We also will be can access this presentation in the YouTube in future. Probably the link will be provided to you all. And thank you all, and have a good day.
Ấy. Ấy. ඔය වෙන තමයි යෝගට මේ පත් ටිකක් කන්න දැන් බඩගින්න නේද? විතරක් තමයි. ඕ මහා වෙනවා වගේ. ඔන්නේ කාන්ති නැතිනේ. එන්නේ එන්නස හොඳටම ගැලපෙනවද? නෑ. ඒ කාන්ති ආතර එන්නේ दुनिया में बहुत करने में और वो जरूरत है කන්නාඩි දෙතන තියලා තියෙනද ෆෝන් එක උඩ හිටලා වගේ රත් වෙලා නේ මම උඩ කියන්නේ නේද නේ චාර්ජර් එක යන රත් වෙනවද ඒක තමයි මටත් උනේ ඔයගොල්ලෝ ඉතින් ගණන් ගත්තේ නැහැ නේ මාව මේ සූම් එක හරිනේ නැහැ මාර නිකන් කම්මැලි කියවගෙන කියලා ඕක හොයාගෙන ඉන්න පුළුවන් ගේ. අඩියයි මානෙට. යසිතා වත්තරන් කන්න. දෙන්නම්. අනේ හකරන්න එපා. නර කන්න කියලා ප්‍රශක්තිය. තේරිය අමාරු අද.